G'day and welcome to a very special edition of our Reef in Focus podcast. My name's Lincoln Bertoli. We're filming on the lands of the Woolgarooga Bar and neighbouring Bindle people, as always, here in Townsville. And today we have a very special guest. You might remember from a few of our previous episodes, we discussed the formation of the marine park, how management has changed and evolved over 50 years. And in the hot seat today is a man who was at the very forefront of it all, when it all started back in 1975, the Reef Authority's very first staff member, former Executive Officer Rod Williams. Hello, mate.
Hello. Pleased to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. We've been wanting to sit down and have a chat with you for a while. I guess you and I have spoken over phone and email for probably the last 6 months, but we have a million questions, and it's only fitting that we're in our new offices here on Stanley Street, wrapping up, I guess, the commemorations of 50 years of the marine park. So can we start, take it all the way back to the 70s, as your career was just sort of taking off,
Yep.
The late 60s and early 70s. You were the very first executive officer for the Reef Authority. How did that all come about?
Well, I think it was in the 60s there was a lot of excitement about saving the Barrier Reef. There was a lot of public issues going on about the crown of thorns starfish. I mean, you really had to have your head in a cloud not to know about the Great Barrier Reef and its importance to Australia. As I indicated earlier, the national estate was set up, and the Barrier Reef was one of the first things in Australia, the first conservation areas to be proclaimed under the national estate. It was divided into oil exploration areas, and drilling had started on some areas. But I myself believe that would never proceed because in some ways it was held sacred. As I indicated earlier, I was very well aware of the potential oil spills, and having heard about and read about the oil spill that happened in Torres Strait around 1970, and also in '69, which I personally experienced in Santa Barbara when there was a blowout there. And I spent a few days down the beaches with my wife trying to save birds. So the issues to me were things like the crown of thorns and the potential for tourism.
Yeah, okay.
And having been educated, I guess, on environmental issues, I had to read a book called The Great Extermination as part of my degree program. I really joined in the environmental movement and got involved in saving Fraser Island, or Gowrie, as it's now called, under John Sinclair.
Now, you touched on it earlier. I guess it seems incredible, as we've said previously, that the Great Barrier Reef was once looked upon as a viable source of oil or petroleum.
Yeah.
Can you recall what were attitudes like, or what was the public attitude towards the Great Barrier Reef at that time?
Well, I think there was some flippancy with respect to the use of the reef. I remember reading in Maurice Young's biography of his experience when he came out in 28, 29 and did that great scientific expedition. The professor at the Cambridge University at the time remarked, well, it's a pity there are islands in the way, otherwise it could be a great trawling area for catching fish. And so there was almost a flippancy about it, but in some ways, people were also covering up in doing that their own love for the reef, and particularly Queenslanders. I mean, I think Queenslanders saw the Barrier Reef as something that was World Heritage at that time, although the World Heritage hadn't been set up. But we acknowledged it as a unique and beautiful place to go to. And it was almost a cathartic introduction that I had, experiencing the importance of the reef. And people who came out here, Maurice Young, but also tourists, people that I met in 68, 69, and even prior to that, because my family were up here and I lived up here on 2 occasions. Just really felt akin to the Barrier Reef. But they hadn't really felt that experience of suddenly discovering it, epiphany, so to speak.
Yeah.
And which I had, I guess in 1968 with my fiance. And lots of people had it once they'd been out on the water, seen the diversity and the complexity of the marine life, fell in love with it.
Yeah, okay. And I guess today we look back at 50 years of marine park management, and it really has, I guess, changed the game in terms of how people look after and manage coral reefs worldwide. It was a very significant movement, the creation of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Now, here's where you come in. What was it like being the very first employee? Can you take us back, I guess? One question I've always wanted to ask you is, it's day one of your tenure as Executive Officer of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. You get up to go to work, but when you have no staff, no office, no boats, where do you start?
Well, having a science degree and a background in doing science and that sort of thing, is you look at the history, and the first thing you go to is, well, what's the history of the Barrier Reef? What sort of conflicts exist here for the environment? I mean, very quickly you realised that there are conflicts, you know, between commercial and recreational fishing, between the tourism and the collection of shells and those sorts of things,
Yep.
and the need for management. And you look overseas and you start to look at the work that's being done overseas. And like, what obviously comes to mind is the marine parks that were declared in the early 70s in Miami. But there's really, you can't really claim this as a national park because it doesn't meet the World Wildlife Fund and also UNESCO requirements for a national park where there's total protection. So, and the legislation, fortunately, you know, Don McMichael tried to integrate various uses, and he was encouraged by this through the science committees and the Marine Science Committee that was set up in 1922 to try and incorporate multiple use. So the thing is, how we are going to address that. And so we had our first meeting the day after I was employed, I think on the 23rd of September 1976. And one of the first things that Don McMichael came out with was not only the location of the authority and where it would manage the reef from, which was selected as being Townsville, but also, you know, we've got the Marine Park region set up in the legislation, in which that is an enabling legislation that allows us to declare marine parks. And on that first day, he said, we are going to make 100% or 99% of that region part of the marine park, because you can't manage it in bits and pieces.
Yeah, wow.
And so that was really, and part of that initiation was about, well, we need to talk to the community. He was fundamentally oriented to, let's get people on side, commercial fishermen, tourist organisation, you know, trawlers. Let's go to the local towns, Gladstone, Rockhampton, Mackay, Cairns, Townsville. Let's meet with the community and find out what the uses are, and that will determine the zoning that has to come under the areas that are declared. But when we're talking about the declared areas, let's try and manage the whole region, because it needs to be managed as a whole, because there's interchange of environments and organisms between the various reefs. You can't manage the reefs in isolation.
Yeah, fair enough.
So it was about this learning and scientific journey that I went on about marine science. But I had an interest in that because I had, as mentioned, I had done studies at Berkeley University about the pollution and species diversity analysis over the 70 or 80 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, about that had radically been changed by pollution. So species diversity in 60 years really plummeted, and we didn't want that to happen in the Barrier Reef, because the Barrier Reef would have been seen as the most complex environmental system in the world. Yeah,
right. And I guess you've almost answered my next question. So apart from the external mechanisms that started to take place, you also tasked with building the governance and the staffing of the authority itself. You said that consultation was a very important and integral approach at the very start, but I can't imagine it all would have been rosy throughout, right? There probably would have been responses from, say, fishermen or tourist operators, etc., that thought maybe we were trying to perhaps keep them away from the reef or anything like that. How did you go about, I guess, explaining what the overall goal is and how important this would be moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing that we wanted to do was to make contact with the senior officers in each of the departments in both Queensland and the Commonwealth, and that meant meeting with all the heads of the relevant departments in Queensland, like mining and fishing and national parks. We did that through the consultative committee. The heads of those departments had been appointed. I think there were 6 from the federal government and 6 from the state government. There was discussion about what the role of the authority is. Some people had a view that it should be a very small organisation of only half a dozen people, and it should operate through the various departments. To the authority members themselves that felt that if we're going to have a coordinated program between the various departments, that needed to be done by the authority rather than by the Australian National Parks or the Queensland National Parks, which really didn't have respect for the various multiple uses that needed to be catered for, and hence the issue of how that would feed into the zoning of the various areas.
Yeah, and just on that, I guess we often talk now around how zoning is sort of one of the primary tools in our toolkit when we talk about reef management. Was it a groundbreaking thing at the time to start to zone sections of the marine park?
Oh, exactly. And I mean, a lot of that discussion had been going on for, I guess, years. You know, Patricia Ma from the Marine Science Committee, I mean, they'd been discussing the need for protection of the Great Barrier Reef. Their orientation, unfortunately, was a bit more towards the geological side of the reef and how Darwin's theories of reef formation came in, which was the main issue that was being debated then. But I think we all appreciated at the time that this was a very important tourist area, it was a very important commercial area, that the local cities, towns, well, you name them, were dependent upon the reef for a lot of their economic. And one of the first things we did was we also had an input-output economic study done of the value of the various commercial components to the prosperity of the various communities along the reef. And that was done in the first year under the auspices of the Queensland University. And so we had involved a lot of, I guess, senior researchers, both from the Barrier Reef Committee, but also from the various universities. And particularly the James Cook University. I mean, one of the challenges we faced was more the location of the reefs at that particular time. We were relying on maps of, you know, Matthew Flinders and Captain Cook, and we didn't have satellite imagery. I mean, Landsat just came into effect, I guess, in 77, 78, and very early we coordinated with the James Cook University and CSIRO in actually locating where the reefs were. But to our surprise, I mean, some of that early mapping was phenomenally accurate within 20 kilometres or
Unbelievable.
so. But the Landsat brought it down to about a metre or two.
Yeah, wow.
So it really made a big difference. And that was very important to feed into the zoning. And of course the other thing was actually the Marine Park Authority undertook physical surveys themselves of the biological fauna and flora that were on the various reefs. And so we developed mechanisms for mapping the reefs ourselves and the biota on the reefs. And that was a very important feed, as well as, you know, people like Alison Dom and also Keys Young, I guess in the first 2 years had very large community consultation programs. And that reporting on those results of, I guess, what the community wanted played a big role in determining what the zones would be.
Of course. And you just touched on looking at the studies that determined what the reef was worth, you know, to the national economy and the communities that relied on it. Obviously, we're doing the very same thing today. We know that it's worth tens of billions to the economy. We know that there's 77,000 people that rely almost directly on the reef for employment. I want to take you back in line with that, I guess. We know today that climate change is one of the biggest threats to the Great Barrier Reef and will determine how we manage it moving forward. Looking back, you know, to the late 70s and early 80s, are there similarities? Was climate change discussed back then? What were the main threats that you were looking at to the reef?
Well, I guess the consciousness of climate change really arose in the 80s. What we saw as the biggest threat was the overfishing, you know, particularly trawling. I guess tourism, people collecting shells and also, you know, riding turtles and stuff like that. So we needed to have a much more, I guess, cleaner focus on how we needed to manage, but also acknowledging that, you know, there were huge businesses that were being developed in terms of tourism. And in the 60s, the reef really became a tourism mecca for Queensland. Although I guess my recollection is probably 500,000 people visited the reef, and that was mainly focused on things like the Whitsunday, Green Island and Heron Island. But now I think it's probably like 2.5 million or some figure
Yeah.
like that, the people. But I guess the other concern was just the lack of information. I mean, we talk about how many tourists visited the reef or the value of the tourism to the economy and how much the commercial fishermen was to the economy. A lot of that studies hadn't been done.
Yeah.
So we brought a bit of, you know, I guess an intellectual, scientific approach to getting real values on both economic, biological
Yeah, okay.
and the reef itself.
And we start to see, I guess, in line with some of these cumulative pressures today, things like significant bleaching events across the Great Barrier Reef. Was that an occurrence back then, or were they sort of few and far between?
Well, I hadn't heard of bleaching until the 82 occurrence, and that was just after I had left. I think it was only in the 80s we started to realise that climate change would have significant impacts on the reef. And the problem, you know, we just accept, you know, that, you know, Indonesia has huge amounts of coral and coral fish and species, and the coral here would adapt. But the truth of the matter is that coral adaptation and species changes and species complexity takes thousands of years to change.
Yeah.
And so even though the temperature here in the coral is lower than it is in Indonesia, obviously, it's different coral systems, and unless the corals can adapt, which they can't, except it's thousands of years. So we're getting temperature changes now that we're measuring in terms of decades, and obviously that's breeding extinction, perturbing the species diversity, and I think that's a real concern. And I guess the other thing that's coming out of this, and one of the things that Charlie Veron talks about in his book about corals and coral formation and survival, is that the pH changes are having a significant effect, because with the pH being lowered because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is being absorbed by the ocean, that's actually lowering the pH and therefore changing the ability of the corals to create an external skeleton.
Yep.
Because that's how they live. They create the coral reef as an external skeleton. And if the pH goes down, that's actually being dissolved by the increased acidity.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't think we're fully understanding that, but I'm pleased to see that AIMS is now doing work on looking at regeneration of corals with coral species that are become more tolerant to the changes. But a lot of these changes are global: increase in temperature and increase in increase in acidity.
Yeah.
You know, worldwide changes.
Yeah. From that, I guess, from someone like yourself who's been, you know, involved in this kind of work for, you know, the last 50 years, if you like, before your retirement, how do we tie it all together? What can today's reef managers learn from, I guess, the early years?
Well, I think the important opportunity that's now available is, I guess, to work internationally, you know, through United Nations environmental organisations, and also develop planning that is commensurate with what's happening worldwide, because we can't do it ourselves. We need to identify what the issues are. We need to be fairly aggressive and a bit risk-taking in terms of things like zoning and protection of the reef, because unless we do it here, we can't expect other people to do it.
Yeah.
So we need to lead by example.
And you've touched on my next question, why resilience-based management matters more than ever. Can we finish up, I guess, with, after 50 years, as we said, 5 decades of reef protection, can you expand on that? What still gives you hope that we're moving in the right direction?
Well, I think the detailed knowledge that has come about from scientific expeditions, the work that's being done by AIMS now since they were set up in '72, the work of, you know, Maurice Young that was done in, you know, 28 and 29, and now I guess the publication of the work. And I think one of the things that we really need to be focused on as the authorities, that we should not forget the local people in the communities about education programs of the reef. And the story I told before about people in Townsville not having visited the reef, I think there's an opportunity that we really need to build on, getting the community behind us to acknowledge that we have something unique and very special.
Unreal. Look, your insights are incredible, Rod. I know the staff have really appreciated you coming in and detailing your earliest memories of reef protection from the early 70s. We thank you for your time, mate, and hopefully we get to speak again very soon.
It was a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And if you enjoyed that chat, be sure to check out our earlier episodes of Reef in Focus, available wherever you get your podcasts. See you for the next one.